This episode, we go back to 1893, before you even thought British broadcasting existed. But more generally, in this moment-by-moment chronicle of British broadcasting, we've reached the end of May 1923. Previously, on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. In our moment-by-moment chronicle of British broadcasting, it's not all plain sailing for the 6-month-old BBC. Early 1923 has seen a few live link-ups to theatres, bringing to homes operas like The Magic Flute or pantomimes like Cinderella, but theatrical managers are boycotting Auntie Beeb over low or no wages, as a government inquiry ponders if their licence fee is working, or needs to be increased or scrapped altogether. It's all forced the British Broadcasting Company to almost abandon live broadcasts of plays and concerts, instead going in-house. So last podcast episode, that meant the first full-length Shakespeare with Kathleen Nesbitt and her players, as well as John Henry, the first comedy personality to choose radio rather than the live theatrical scene. But that idea of live theatre link-ups, bringing entertainment to listeners' homes, well, it turns out it isn't quite so new an idea after all. Indeed so. This time, how a device 30 years earlier was doing exactly that. Spotify for the Victorian age, Netflix for the 19th century. The Electrophone, the 1890s streaming device. That's how our episode's guest refers to it. That's Dr. Natasha Kitcher, research fellow at the Science Museum, formerly PhD student at Loughborough University. She's all about the digital history of communications. Wonderful. Yes, broadcasting may be older than you think. 130 years ago, there in your own home, or castle, in Queen Victoria's case, you too could hear your pick of over a dozen West End shows live. Or on Sundays, a choice of church services. It's broadcasting, but not as we know it. We will tell you all you need to know about the Electrophone, the precursor of radio broadcasting, long before this British broadcasting century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London calling.
Hello, this is PK calling, Paul Carenza, your host for episode 91 of our podcast journey through British broadcasting history. As ever, we are nothing to do with today's BBC, or anyone else for that matter. We are entirely a solo-run operation, and as ever, thank you for your support. We shall wear it always. Now, our ambition here is simple. It's to chronicle the earliest days of British broadcasting in this moment-by-moment podcast. Episode 1 began with Marconi and led us to the radio tests of 1920. But all of that's about radio broadcasting. This episode will discover that before radio, there was something which, well, we could call it broadcasting. It involves not wireless, but wires. But then again, isn't that exactly what we do today? We have cable. Most of our entertainment is brought to our homes not wirelessly via radio, but with wires. And that's really what happened in the 1890s. But before we get to that, and to give it some context, I'm eager that we maintain our moment-by-moment guide, which last episode reached the end of May 1923 with the first broadcast full Shakespeare play. Thank you, Dr. Andrea Smith, for illuminating us all about that. And Alan Stafford, the comedy historian, told us all about John Henry, pretty much the first radio comedy personality. So that brings us up then to the start of June. And a quick glance at the newspapers of the day shows that, yes, many listeners had thoroughly enjoyed hearing that Shakespeare. The Westminster Gazette. Very many letters of appreciation of Twelfth Night have been received by the BBC. Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, and other classics are to be given in turn. Yeah, so that first Shakespeare then paved the way for the others. What else have we got? End of May 1923, the Newcastle station gave their first outside broadcast. One of the chief events of the year for the musical Tynesider is the Northern Musical Tournament, a festival on the lines of a Welsh Eisteddfod. Choral and orchestral items have been broadcast from the Newcastle Town Hall each evening. And if that tickles your fancy, Wireless World magazine had good news on the 2nd of June. To enable more listeners with their newly powerful radio sets to listen to different regional stations, there are new broadcasting timetables. An important broadcasting arrangement affecting the owners of valve sets comes into operation on the 1st of June. On and after that date, there will be half-hour intervals in the various broadcasting programmes, allowing listeners in to tune in other stations. Yes, so London, Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, Newcastle, Birmingham, they would all close down for half an hour at a time, so you could then tune in elsewhere. Gone was that idea that just because you lived in an area, that was the station you should listen to. The BBC is going national. But their problems were continuing, especially with the live arts scene. 2nd of June, the Daily Mirror noted, "Contrary to general expectation, La Boheme, in which Dame Nellie Melba sang last night at the Royal Opera House, and which the King and Queen attended, was not broadcast. Dame Melba's agents would not allow the great singer to be broadcast. We think that a concert artist of repute is not worth nearly so much either to herself or to us if she is broadcast." And yes, the irony that Dame Nellie Melba helped launch radio broadcasting to begin with 3 years earlier, almost to the week, that's not lost on us indeed. So by now, Dame Nellie Melba's agents were going, no, giving away the music for free could be damaging our ticket sales. Speaking of early musical pioneers, 4 days later, 6th of June, was the death of Edgar Cooper. Now, that's probably not a name that many of us would remember particularly. We mentioned him way back in the very first few episodes of the podcast. Before Melba even, there was one Winifred Sayer, you may recall, the first professional broadcast artiste, because she was not a Marconi employee. She worked in Hoffman's Ball Bearings, the factory in Chelmsford next door. But she was roped in by the male singer who was a Marconi employee, Edgar Cooper. And so the Chelmsford Chronicle reported, "The possessor of a particularly fine tenor voice. Early in 1920 he often sang through the transmitting apparatus of the Marconi Works and was heard by listeners in all over the country and beyond." While Popular Wireless said, "The first man to sing on the wireless in the days when the Marconi Company were experimenting at Chelmsford." So was Edgar Cooper the first broadcaster to leave us? Maybe so. So that's early June of 1923, and next episode will land more in this particular month, where we bring to you what some call the first sports broadcast. I beg to differ. But either way, next time, Edgar Wallace on horse racing. One other thing of note from June of 1923, before we delve back 30 years earlier, that radio pioneer and first voice of the BBC, Arthur Burrows, gave a talk in June 1923 on the BBC. "We know that by the very nature of our work, it will never be possible for us to satisfy at one and the same time every section of our vast audience. Unlike all other forms of entertainment, which only draw to their houses just that section of the public specially interested in their particular type of amusement, we have to cater simultaneously for every grade of society and practically every variety of temperament and taste." So that 6-month-old BBC was still working out how you can entertain the nation. But 30 years earlier, those same ideas were bubbling around, using technology to bring entertainment to people's homes. Time for this episode's guest then, telling us all about the 130-year-old device that every home should have, the Electrophone. Delighted to welcome to the British Broadcasting Century podcast now, research fellow focused on the digital history of communications for the Science Museum's Congruence Engine project. Try say that without your teeth in. And formerly PhD student to Loughborough University and expert in the wonders of the Electrophone, Dr. Natasha Kitcher.
Hello.
Hello, welcome. What first drew you to the Electrophone? Maybe we should begin with that.
So it came to me, the Electrophone found me really, at a time when I was trying to decide if I was going to study the history of science or the history of people and culture and arts. And then I found this lovely object that's both. And really, generally, the history of media sits in a lovely position between both. It's technology that people are continuously interacting with and shaping.
It's one of those seemingly, correct me if I'm wrong, but quirky areas that it seems like no one's really talking about it much. And yet it's there before broadcasting comes along, almost doing what broadcasting ended up doing in many ways.
Yes. So, I mean, we have beef really, Paul, because you've been wandering around claiming it's been 100 years of broadcasting.
I know, I'm
now
sorry.
102 years. And I've been sat in my office in Loughborough beavering away on the history of the Electrophone, which started 1893 and is a broadcasting device. Wow,
that is a bold claim, which I look forward to now hearing you explain. And firstly, apologies that, yes, I clearly have been part of the machine. I mean, I rant and rail frequently at the BBC and the media and others getting things wrong about the very early days. And, you end up tearing your hair out going, that wasn't the first, that was the first. And then you discover actually that thing you thought was the first wasn't the first after all. In terms of the prehistory of the electrophone, 1892 is a bit of a red letter date. There was an electrical exhibition at Crystal Palace, and that included the transmission of music from a distant source, that is the Lyric Theatre in London, plus music from Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester. Concerts sent to you via a telephone line, showing the visitors at Crystal Palace just what this new technology could do, showcasing broadcast entertainment, really. And a decade before that, we should meet Theodore Puskas, the Hungarian inventor of the telephone exchange, who demonstrated a new method of organising and fitting a telephone newspaper at the electrical exhibition in Paris. His son, back in Budapest, then went on to inaugurate a regular newspaper service via the telephone line. It's one-to-many, and it's news. Just what wireless broadcasting would do 30 years later.
Paint the picture for us then. Electrophone. This comes in late Victorian era, and what sort of world is it coming into at this point?
Yes, so very late Victorian era. The telephone has arrived in England, but people aren't too sure what it's going to be yet. So let's completely forget that now you know a telephone is a way to call your mum. At the time, it's a new way of streaming information. It's sending audio far away. So it could do a lot of different things. And one of the early propositions is maybe we could use it to start streaming theatre performances or church services, or maybe even do news broadcasting, which is, of course, what radio will be doing a bit later. So the National Telephone Company get a few people together and say, OK, start looking into patents. Let's see if it's going to be possible to stream theatre. They go over to France, where the Theatrephone exists, which is a telephone just for theatre streaming. They acquire the patent and they bring it to England, and they start setting up shop, and that becomes Electrophone Limited. And it's a device that will let you stream theatre, it will let you stream church services. The company hope that it could become kind of Zoom. So they're hoping that people might be able to call into work, listen to live legal conversations happening, maybe use it for journalism, and also maybe use it for news broadcasting. That these kind of ideas die off, and the theatre and the church services really persist up until the end of the company in 1938.
Dr. Natasha Kitcher has written various articles about the electrophone. We'll put the links to a few of those in the show notes. Also, via those links, you can see pictures of the electrophones themselves. It looks like a bit of a sort of stethoscope to me, I suppose. Arguably, these are the first headphones in the world. And in fact, on our recent British Broadcasting Century walking tour around central London, taking in the sights and smells and sounds of BBC and pre-BBC sites, we stopped by what would have been the Electrophone HQ, Pelican House on Gerrard Street. Now it's Everwell Chinese Medicine there, right in the middle of Chinatown. Needs a blue plaque on that wall saying the Electrophone was here and the birthplace of the headphones. More information at the end of this episode if you would like to come on a future walking tour, so stay tuned for that. But for now, back to Dr. Natasha Kitcher.
So it doesn't become everything they're imagining at the very start. I think probably most companies experience that.
You've got to try, haven't you? Yeah.
It's around for a lot longer than I think anyone's ever given it credit for. And it has a lot more users than people realise. And especially it's very high up people in society are using this. So Lloyd George has one installed at number 10 when he is when he's Prime Minister. The royal family specifically requests to have it installed at Sandringham. So it's having quite an impact when it's around. It's kind of become entangled, and this is a big focus of my thesis. It's become entangled with this idea of failure because you don't know what it is now. You forgot what it is. So therefore, there must have been something wrong with it. But I don't think that's necessarily correct. And I think it's a really nice object that makes you challenge why you don't know it existed, and makes you start to think, okay, why did we forget it? And who decided we should forget it? And this may be where the broadcasting conversation comes in.
I see. Well, in which case I should apologise for the second time this call for not only trampling over the 100 years, you're thinking it's 100 years, but also continuing that narrative a little there of, I don't know if I said the word failure, but I sort of hinted at a failed company that didn't quite land as it hoped. But then maybe by positing that to you, it is a chance for me to sort of say, this is what people have been, how it's been painted over the years, but it's actually a lot more innovative by the sounds of it and pioneering and deserves a lot more credit.
Well, and if you're talking about Electrophone Limited, it was a company that set up to make profit. It stopped making profit, so it closed.
Right.
Okay, call that a failure.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about the technology, which is this innovative form of streaming way before you thought streaming existed. Let's not call that a failure, and let's not confuse Electrophone Limited with the Electrophone.
This 1902 flyer for the Electrophone. Entertainments and places of worship on the Electrophone service. Every night, Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon and evening. The theatres include Alhambra, Apollo, Daly's, Drury Lane, Duke of York's, Empire, Gaiety, Garrick, Queen's Hall, Lyric, Palace, Pavilion, Prince of Wales, Savoy, Shaftesbury, Suburban Theatres, Tivoli, St James's Hall and Royal Albert Hall. And as for the preachers you could hear, well, they're listed by name on the flyer. Yes, you too could hear Canon William Barker, M.A., St Marylebone. Canon James Fleming, D.D., St Michael's, Chester Square. Reverend J. Hamilton Akerson, M.A., All Souls, Langham Place. Right next to today's BBC. The exact place where the daily service came from for many years. And many other churches besides. No installation charge. Reply to the Electrophone Limited, 3435 Gerrard Street, Shaftesbury Avenue, London. The Electrophone then is quite localised. It's like London, and is it Bournemouth? Is that right? Where you could have this? And Sandringham, you said as well, though. So it's all over the different places.
Yeah, so it's predominantly in London. And then I love the Bournemouth aspect because I'm actually from Bournemouth. So it's super freak. But it lasts for the longest period in Bournemouth. And while it kind of starts as this like, oh, here's a kind of sexy new telephone. You can listen to theatre. You don't need to go out. You could have your friends around. What it really is in the kind of the last 10 years in Bournemouth is the device that the elderly are using to phone into church services. So it's really had quite a shift in the kind of style of the Electrophone. But it does tend to be quite localised. And actually that Sandringham instance, it's the King and Queen, so they're going to say yes. And then the post office themselves spend quite a long time investigating how to get new trunk lines installed, and spend like a weekend with the King and Queen saying, okay, is that good enough for you now? Is that good enough? Is there crinkling on the line? And all of that sort of thing. So it's really London and Bournemouth. I have a suspicion there were northern instances, and I've researched it for 4 years and not found them. But I still think there's something there, and it's just a lack of source material available, which again ties in with this idea of failure and forgetting, and why have we forgotten certain things. But yeah, massive in London. You can even trace it on a map, just the whole street of theatres that are all connected to the Electrophone, and you would be able to phone the Exchange and request connection to any of these theatres that are all like meters apart. You can walk through them now. To sit in one's armchair and listen to the favourite items of entertainment in progress at the leading London theatres and musicals is certainly an agreeable method of spending an hour or two. So says another flyer. For the entire year, £5 for 2 persons, 1 performance nightly, £10 for 4 persons. Receivers for 4 persons, attached to a small portable stand with a special transmitter to speak to the operator, can have all performances available and can change from one performance to another. Although that may annoy some of your guests, essentially this is the 1890s equivalent of arguing over the remote control.
There's West End shows I'd love to see, but I can't afford to go and see them all. I haven't got the time to see them all.
Yep.
We need this back, I think, by the sound. I know there's National Theatre Live, and it's clearly the ancestor of that, but I mean, what an opportunity that if you had this, you could dial into, was it a dozen different London theatres or something?
Yes, even though, counterpoint, if you're a really picky director, and there's instances of this in the source material, and you're out for the night, so the actors are thinking, okay, relax, I can maybe have a bit more fun in this performance. And then actually the director's phoned in to listen, and they'll still give you notes. You don't even know if they're there.
That's true.
So obviously, yeah, a great thing. Probably frightening for the actors.
Do we know if the actors actually knew this? Presumably they were aware. Like, I don't even. I mean, nowadays, like legally, they have to be told they're being transmitted into homes. Towards
the end of the Electrophone, there's a theatre agent who wrote quite a damning newspaper article, and it's like 3 pages. And it's when BBC exists as well. So they're critiquing Electrophone, but also really BBC. And they're saying that it's actually really dangerous for their actors to be streamed over this technology because it's not a direct copy of their voice. So they probably don't sound great. And the Electrophone, the microphones are along the floor, which is obviously going to be horrendously stompy.
It's true.
There's also really interesting conversations to be had around gender. So who is developing the microphone technology? It's men. So they're checking it works on their voice. They're not even consciously excluding the women. That's just how it's working. And then you get maybe the West End's best soprano. She comes along. She sings incredibly high. It's not going to transmit nicely on these really new microphones. And so then the theatre agent's being told, we're not booking your soprano because she sounded rubbish on Thursday night. So there's
Right.
actually a big risk for the actors.
Wow. That's huge, isn't it? I remember reading just a little minor comment somewhere in the early part of the Marconi broadcasting story of Captain H.J. Round in Chelmsford, when they had the chance to have singing. They had Winifred Sayer as the singer in February, was it 1920? And somewhere there's a comment from him saying, "Oh yes, it'd be interesting to try it on a woman's voice." Almost like it's an afterthought, like, "Oh yeah, well actually, till now it's been men, hasn't it?" And this idea that actually our microphones may need to be developed further for the range. So you have female singers in 1920, and Captain Round, who was, as far as I can gather, a complete engineering genius, and he was
owned an electrophone.
And did he own an electrophone? Oh, wonderful!
He did. You can now see the table in the Science Museum collection that he owned.
Oh, wonderful! Really,
yeah.
This is very cool. He was certainly operating for the Marconi Company around in the late 1890s, so he maybe was listening in then. I mean, Captain Round comes up a lot on this podcast, and his I know a lot of his grandchildren listen as well. So if you want to go and see your granddad's table, head to the Science Museum. There you go.
Yes.
But so, do you have an idea then? Paint the picture for us of what it would be like then at home. So is it families sitting around with these sort of headphones on, earpieces and the like, or you invite friends around, or do it alone? I don't know.
I mean, how are you watching TV?
That's a good point. Nowadays, on a phone, on a bus, whatever. Yeah.
It was definitely targeted at either of those options. Part of the early advertising that notes you can still get dressed up. You're going to invite all of your generally female friends, and thank goodness you don't need to leave the house and be seen outside now, because you can stay at home to listen to the theatre. Wow. So again, really interesting gender side of it. I know there's some lovely recollections of especially people from Bournemouth who were writing in the 60s and remembering listening to things when they were children. So we know that families were listening to it. But then again, there's really quite funny periodicals from about 1912, where it was men that were writing in to say, "Oh, this is great. I'm listening to this church service and I don't even need to put my trousers on." So it's up to you how you want to listen to it, really. And they were as creative as we are, I'd say.
Well, that ties in there with John Reith was trying to broadcast the royal wedding of, was it 1923? I think it was. And the royal couple were all for it. It was what I think it was the Queen Mum, Queen Elizabeth's parents. But the Dean of Westminster, who said we couldn't possibly broadcast the royal wedding because men might be listening in public houses with their hats on, as if they wouldn't dare take the hat off, let alone, as you're talking about, a church service where people are brazenly talking about listening to it without their trousers on. This is shocking.
Quite interestingly, the managing director of Electrophone, he's this man called Mr. Booth. And if you search for Electrophone material, you will find a letter from Mr. Booth. He was everywhere. And I can't even imagine what he wrote that we can't see. He was just prolific. But he wrote to members of the royal family asking if he could stream their wedding, because he would just ask. This man definitely was not in any way anxious. So he wrote to a princess, I think it was Princess Anne, but let's not quote me on that, saying, "Hi, can I stream your wedding?" And then got a very formal reply back saying, "This is something you need to speak to actual Parliament about. She doesn't get a say in this kind of question." Wow. And then we don't know what happened. There's no further paper trail. But so even he had this idea. He was very much pre-BBC, thinking the same things, perhaps just with fewer politicians on his side. So the fact that BBC get permission to stream news, but Electrophone cannot, I think, is probably because of who Mr. Booth knows.
We've heard previously on the podcast how church leaders could be a little unsettled at first with the idea of transmitting church services. Was it blasphemy? Would it just discourage people from going to church? Well, back in the 1890s, the transmission of Sunday services via Electrophone caused some concerns that they might be reduced to carrying out services in a perfectly empty church. Yes, what if broadcasting steals the congregations? Well, as a churchgoer myself, I can report that yes, I think that has happened, actually, in the last 130 years. Makes you think. Maybe it all started with the Electrophone.
There was one preacher at St. Martin's in the Field who would use the Electrophone quite cunningly. So he would know that there was a lady at the back of the church who didn't like what he was about to say, but he knew that the people listening to the Electrophone might be more up for the proposition. So he would kind of whisper into the microphone, and the microphone itself would be a large fake Bible below him. So he'd say, okay, this one is for you at home, and add a
brilliant.
little extra to a sermon just for the people listening at home.
And I know when they have the first religious broadcasting on via radio coming along in the 20s, there's talk in the newspaper of saying, oh, this is no different really. For those who fear technology in churches, they don't mention electrophone, but they do mention about those people who could sit at the back and plug in headphones into the pews to hear it amplified, which I found odd because I've been to hundreds of churches. I've never seen that technology still there today. So at some point that must have been generally taken out. And there must be some churches that still have those leftover bits and pieces there, but I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea. There's a man called Mr. David in Cardiff in kind of 1924, I think, and he wrote personally to the post office to request an electrophone be installed, but within the church. So that's exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. He names the church, so it'd be quite fun to just go have a look.
I mean, there's so many churches have not changed in centuries. There must be some there, but I would wonder if some of these churches have them, but the people, the vicars and people who run the church don't really know what it is anymore. So there must be, but then pews are being taken out all the time, so there must be fewer by the week, I'd have thought.
My first year of PhD, I spent maybe a week or two phoning random churches in Bournemouth. Like, hello, I have a slightly crazy proposition for you and a slightly strange question, but do you have this thing? And you might not know what it is, but it's kind of Y-shaped. You might have a hexagonal table. I mean, the electrophone looks very distinct. And it was big in Bournemouth, and it was big in Bournemouth churches. So I was like, there's a vague chance. No hits, unfortunately.
No hits. The whole streaming thing is maybe not as new as we think by the looks of it.
No, so I mean, throughout my thesis, I deliberately conflated broadcasting and streaming. I think separating them at this moment can cause quite a lot of challenges for broadcast media. And I was like, oh, well, I'm streaming. I'm like, well, frankly, you're doing the same thing. I don't know if you think they need to be different.
Well, I mean, there's discussions, forgetting the history side, like not that we can ever forget history, but putting that one side for a minute, there are discussions ongoing about whether broadcasting, streaming, does it all come under media? Do we call it public service broadcasting anymore? Public service media? Is there a public service media anymore? All these things are being wrapped up in just arguably semantics as to what degree something is broadcast. Then I'm getting a bit obsessed with the word broadcast now as well, because I found this week this thing which you may know about, others I don't know if our listeners or if academics know these things or not, but I found this really niche mention in a history of Marconi book from the 60s that mentioned a royal demonstration of a radio broadcast in 1906. So I always think of Reginald Fessenden is often cited as the first entertainment broadcast. Christmas Eve that year, coast of Massachusetts, violin solo, a song, Handel's Largo, that reading from the Bible. But 6 months earlier, there's Queen Alexandra and Edward VII in a laboratory in Newcastle University being demonstrated by a Professor Thornton. And there's a picture in an article from a newspaper as well of this moment where there's about 7 different scientific experiments they're having demonstrated. And one of them is the demonstration of the transmission of sound from down the corridor, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And this bizarre message comes through saying, we are the arc transmitter. We greet your majesties and wish you health and happiness, or something like that. And then plays them a song and a whistling solo, which they particularly enjoyed because they love a bit of a whistling solo. So I'd never encountered this before. It's bizarre. But then you think, is that, and in the Marconi history book, it says this is potentially the first music broadcast. But then you think, is that technically a broadcast? It's like a transmission via radio. But to cast it broadly, you kind of have that idea of what you're talking about, which is not necessarily wireless, but it's casting, it's spreading it so that many people can listen in wherever they are.
Exactly. One-to-many broadcasting versus one-to-one.
Yeah.
Although they're very entangled, and they become even more entangled when you're streaming, because, I mean, is the way you're receiving the data just broadly cast out? No, it is encoded. It's just one-to-one, really, isn't it?
Oh, gosh, I've not thought of that. Oh,
so,
you're scrambling my mind.
I think they become so entangled, almost let's not bother separating them.
So then is it media? Is it just is it just sent out media? I didn't even need to say transmitted, but I suppose it is transmitted, isn't it? Transmitted literally means to send out. So Netflix is transmitted media. I think we can probably agree on that. I'm still trying to wrangle it around my head.
It's definitely streamed. Yeah, I mean, the broadcasting issue, it's not live. And do we want liveness to be entangled with broadcast?
Yeah.
Electrophone, absolutely live. Early radio, live. Nowadays, things are less live.
And Arthur Burrows of the BBC wrote letters to the Manchester station of the BBC within a few weeks of the BBC starting, saying, "You're playing gramophone records. How dare you? This is not live. This is cheating the audience." You know, they want live performances, so they had their hands slapped for that. But yeah.
And I mean, with the theatre thing, it's very different if it's live or if it's repeatable. Thinking again of the poor actor that doesn't know the director's listening. If you're performing and it's a one-off and someone might be listening in and you say your line wrong, at least it's done. Whereas if you say your line wrong when they're recording National Theatre Live, I can watch it for the next 30 years and laugh at that, you know? So to the actor, it matters a lot, actually, the way it's transmitted. I was quite interested that you were saying it's 1906, that the royal family listened to radio, because that's the same year they get their Electrophone installed. So they're having a big year.
Huh.
Maybe that the radio inspired them to go get their Electrophone subscription. They didn't care they were different. Yeah.
This is July, I think.
Well, they made their request in June and they got their installation in October.
It's a tale I've not really read about anywhere, so it's sort of an odd little quirky thing. But again, I don't know if it counts as broadcasting because it's radio down a corridor, but essentially.
The current definition of broadcasting, if you Google it, if you go in the Oxford Dictionary or the Cambridge Dictionary, it says radio or television. So it's medium specific, which then means if Marconi in 1906 says, okay, I broadcast using a walkie-talkie that was using radio signal to you at the end of the corridor, then they can say that's broadcast. But these things aren't fixed. They are up for debate.
The liveness factor, firstly, when you listen to the radio in the car or something or out about, and then if you miss a bit and you come back and listen to it later, that feels different. It feels different to not be listening at the same time as everyone else. Or indeed, when we watch live television now, we're watching Strictly, knowing everyone else is watching at the same time, that feels different to watching it on catch up later on or the next day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's this odd little quirk as well so one of the things I do the pause for thought thing with Radio 2, and it used to be that we've got our own BBC Sounds channel now, which we've been asking for ages, because for ages, if you search for pause for thought, you got thought for the day, and that's really annoying because we hate each other. We don't hate each other, but we, respectfully disagree. But it used to be then, when you had on BBC Sounds, it would sort of just cut in at random with the conversation with Zoe Ball, whoever, saying, and now here's Paul Carenza with the pause for thought. Chit chat. You do your pause for thought, and it will just cut off. And it sounded like you're listening to a bit of a live radio show. But now it's more polished. You get a little musical intro, a little musical outro. You get none of the presenter chat. You're just straight in with the little pause for thought thing. And it sounds better. It's more presented, but it does no longer sound like live radio at all. It sounds like a program on its own. And so you lose something, I think. You don't get a sense of that even recorded liveness, which is a shame in a way, I think, maybe.
Do you think the demographic listening to you live versus the demographic listening to these little clips is very different?
It's a good point. Yeah, I think it's bound to be. And also, and tied in with that as well, you've got the way, like the day, and again, while I'm on religious broadcasting, the daily service moves from long wave to Radio 4 Extra. But that, again, massively different audience, especially given you have a very high average age for listeners of that. And I don't know how many, 90-year-olds used to listen to it on an old long wave radio. Will they find it on digital? I don't know.
Well, and I mean, you grow up with the media you're using, right? So the media that seems old probably seems old when you are slightly older.
True.
You've been using it the whole time and you're probably not that interested in changing. So in the case of the Electrophone, it exists for 16 years after BBC starts, which might be surprising. But maybe if you've used the Electrophone all your life, you can't be bothered. It works.
Yeah.
Why would you change?
Of course, all good things must come to an end, and so must the Electrophone. 17th of June 1925, when the BBC was 2.5 years old, this featured in the Times newspaper. In consequence of a large number of our subscribers having given up the Electrophone in favour of wireless, the revenue has so largely decreased that the Postmaster General has decided to withdraw the licence granted to this company and to serve notice that the Electrophone service is to be terminated on the 30th of June. We have, therefore, no option but to hereby notify you with extreme regret that after the 30th of this month we shall no longer be in a position to continue the Electrophone hearings. The end of an era.
This whole thesis, I was intending to go around and look at different electrophones and see how they've been used, maybe how the tables have been used for different things. And then I found out that in 1925, the post office issued the order to destroy all electrophone stock.
Shocking. They're not thinking of the archivists and the academics of tomorrow.
Exactly. Even though, interestingly, all of my source material that I have has been stamped by the post office saying, okay, we'll preserve this. So they kind of knew I wanted it.
Right.
But a lot of the stock was destroyed, and the post office were in the habit of recycling cabling, which is perfectly sensible. And so the electrophone probably lives on within other telephones. And then some of the tables would have been bought by furniture companies. So you can find the tables quite often, but the electrophone headsets are very hard to come by. If anyone finds one, I'd love to see it.
Do let us know. Absolutely. Well, yes. Well, be in touch, please, listeners. If we know any more electrophone things, clearly this is the stories are still coming out. But where do we go to find out more from what you're doing?
So there's various blog posts out there. Recently, 66,000 people suddenly had a resurgence on the Science Museum Electrophone blog. So if you're interested, please do check it out.
Very good. We'll put a link in the show notes as well. Yes.
Yes. And hopefully some more publications and chats to come soon. I've finished my thesis now, so I'll start shoving it down everyone's throats.
Absolutely. Too right. Well, we need the book, we need the film, we need Electrophone the movie, get it out there.
Electrophone the film coming soon.
Absolutely. Ironically, coming to Netflix, and then that can be streamed into our homes.
At least 3 people will love it.
My thanks to Dr. Natasha Kitcher for illuminating us all about the Electrophone. There's some beautiful pictures of Pelican House, the home of the Electrophone, 36 Gerrard Street. We'll link to it in the show notes, and we'll put it on our social media on Facebook and Twitter. Do search for British Broadcasting Century. You will find us there. They're lovely pictures, well worth a look. And if you'd like to join me on a future walking tour around the streets of London, I will show you not just where the BBC is, was and has been, but we'll look at the home of the Electrophone as well. See how within a couple of square miles, all of these wonderful, magical, technological miracles came to pass. Our Electrophone stop was about 30 seconds away from where John Logie Baird first publicly demonstrated television, and a couple of minutes after that we found ourselves at the first BBC HQ, Magnet House. So there, in the middle of it all, was the Electrophone's home. Although, of course, really its home was your home. Next time on the podcast, we're back in 1923. It's June, and the BBC has a sports report for us from the author Edgar Wallace. He's been to the horse races. He wants to tell us all about it. But is it the first sports report of British broadcasting? Some would say so. I think we need an episode to dig into that. We'll bring you horse racing, boxing and rugby at least next time. Maybe a bit of football as well. That'll be episode 92. And if you want more content in the meantime, do join us on Patreon, where you can find videos and behind-the-scenesy bits of all of this as well, including a Google Maps Street View version of our walking tour. All of that's £5 a month, cheaper in today's terms than the Electrophone subscription. I'm just saying. And it all helps support the podcast. So thank you if you support us there, or indeed support us for free by just sharing this podcast with someone you know and love who you think might enjoy it. You could share it on social media, pop it in an email, write it on a postcard and deliver it to your neighbours, chat about it over the garden fence, whatever it is. Just have the British Broadcasting Century at the forefront of your mind in the next week. All right, it's a bit much to ask, but your recommendations are most welcome. Now, going forward from here, we may be a little bit delayed in getting you the episodes quite as quickly as we historically have. That's largely because of some family health matters of late, which have seen me suddenly have to chase around parts of Surrey to different hospitals and clinics for a variety of reasons. Shan't bore you with the details, other than to say, if there's a minor gap between episodes, please forgive me going forward until things settle down a little.
Oh, and look out for Paul on the recent Songs of Praise, all about the first religious broadcasts. Link in show notes, if it's still on iPlayer, or ask your friendly Electrophone operator.
But one thing I am continuing to do is go on tour with an evening of very old radio. You can catch me this autumn in Gloucestershire, in Calverton, in Nottinghamshire. I'll be in Essex, in Danbury, at the Christians in Media Conference in October at St Martin in the Fields. I'll be talking a bit about BBC religion history. Then where else? Then we are back in Gloucestershire, where we've got Shropshire and Kent, Essex, Sussex. I think there's about 20 dates there, so suddenly that's all got rather busy. Head to paulcarenza.com/tour for all the dates and details. And if I'm not going near you and you have a venue, or you know a venue, or you've got a friend of a mate who knows someone near a venue, get them to drop me a line. I am quite reactive rather than proactive when it comes to the bookings. So if someone gets in touch, generally speaking, I go there. Paul@paulcarenza.com is my email address, and you're welcome to drop me a line about that or anything to do with the podcast. I'm thinking once again we need to bring back the FMs and AMs, the first-hand memories and the airwave memories. So I might start to do a correspondence slot once again towards the end of each podcast. So you can set the agenda of that. Ask your questions, give us your feedback, and rate and review the podcast where you found it. Thanks very much all the same. All that remains to say is that the British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. Original music is composed by Will Farmer. Do find us on Facebook and Twitter, or X as I believe they call it nowadays. No one calls it that, Elon. We're just here to inform, educate and entertain, so thank you for joining us, and join us next time for the first sports report of British Broadcasting, or is it? We'll get competitive and see who wins the trophy for the earliest sport of British Broadcasting. Here on the British Broadcasting Century.